Thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. We really appreciate it. I am honored to introduce Bill Shadel, our Coastal Projects Manager. He's going to be giving you guys a presentation this afternoon. He has been with the Nature Conservancy since November of 2018, helping us on the coastal team advance the implementation of nature-based solutions to flooding here in New Jersey. The majority of Bill's career has been in coastal ecological restoration. He's worked for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, New Jersey Meadowlands Commission, as well as 2 other NGOs, including the American Littoral Society and Save the Sound, where he directed each of their habitat restoration programs. Immediately prior to joining the Conservancy, Bill was self-employed, consulting homeowners, towns, and nonprofits on a variety of natural resources issues, including Living Shorelines, which he's going to be presenting on this afternoon. He is a certified ecologist by the Ecological Society of America and a certified ecological restoration practitioner by the Society for Ecological Restoration. He holds a MS in botany from the University of Vermont and a BA in history and a BS in landscape architecture from our very own Rutgers University. So with that, I will hand it over to Bill for his presentation.
Thank you, Patty. Good afternoon, everyone. I remember the first time I learned about living shorelines. It was a project that was done at this site here. I was in a conference room getting an informal presentation by a colleague, Tracy Scrable, from the North Carolina Coastal Federation, and she was describing what her organization did at this site. This is in North Carolina, one of the bays. I don't have a name of the town, but I'll tell you in the next slide why I realize this is well up one of their rivers. So this is what they did. So now in this previous slide, parking lots in the background, you have a wooden bulkhead in the diagonally across in the middle. The bulkhead and parking lot are to your right-hand side. And all they just simply did was put in basically this line of rocks, and that was it. Over time, because rocks calm the water, or some structure can calm the water, on the right-hand side to the rocks, on the right-hand side of the rocks, sediment could accumulate on its own. And when it got to the right elevation, native marsh plants could colonize. And so to me, that was just so elegant and it's what's fascinating about ecological restoration and why I got into the field is this idea that we can just sort of tweak the system and nature will take over, natural forces, the biological organisms, things like that. So, and I'll tell you why I know this is well up one of the estuaries. This is a tidal site, but it's tidal fresh, or mostly fresh. And I can tell because, and some of you probably know this purple flower in the corner is pickerel weed, and the brown is cattail. And so those grow in fresh water. So before I get into defining living shorelines and getting into different types, I want to talk about why we care about them. And so why we care about shorelines. So this graphic here has, it's the sloping shoreline like we have in most of coastal New Jersey, most of our bays. Not the ocean side, this is a bay side issue. And you have marsh here. You have some seagrass here. This would be eelgrass in our area. Some macroalgae on the bottom. You have microalgae here, smaller fish near the shoreline, larger fish off the shoreline, oysters over here. And this is just sort of to say, like, so estuaries, and you probably, if you heard this from Patty, you may already know this, estuaries are really valuable to our fish and other species. Most of our commercial and recreational fish require estuaries for some part of their life cycle. So without estuaries, we would not have them. And within an estuary, the intertidal and nearshore habitat is really where it's at, in my view. It's where the water sometimes covers the land, sometimes it's exposed. When it's exposed, you have exposed mud flats and sand flats. Shorebirds come in and feed. When the water goes back in, wading birds will come in and feed. Small fish will then have access to the marshes and other areas. And in the smaller water, the shallower water, small fish take refuge from larger fish. So this is why shorelines are important and what we do to them matters. Okay, ding ding, our first trivia question. New Jersey has 130 miles of coastline and how many miles of tidal shoreline? So how many miles of tidal shoreline? The choices are 600 miles, 1,200 miles, 1,800 miles, 2,400 miles. Okay, I think we're ready to close the poll. Okay, the majority picked 1,200, second was 1,800, and the right answer is 1,800 miles. So if you count up all the, if this might have confused some people, 130 miles of our coastline, basically from Sandy Hook to Cape May is basically that 130 miles. But then once you get into the bays and tidal rivers and things, it really adds up. So 1,800, it's just shy of 1,800 in the data I have. Okay, so shoreline erosion isn't always a bad thing. It's just bad to us when it happens to things we care about and in places we care about. So this is a site on the Navesink River in Red Bank. There's an old wooden bulkhead. I happen to know it's homemade, well past its prime. You can see all the erosion. They have their lawn to the left there and above, and then just exposed sediment, soil. And so shoreline erosion, if it encroaches on a home, a driveway, a road, some built infrastructure, tends to be when we start to care and get involved in protecting it. And the typical response is to put up a rigid vertical wall, like a bulkhead or a seawall. This is a shot in the Shark River. And so I'll tell you that in a bit, my next slide, but this marsh in front of it, if the wave energy is high enough here, I mean, there's a lot of waves hitting that wall, that marsh is going to erode and it'll be gone. If that marsh stays, it means the wave energy isn't that strong. They probably didn't need a bulkhead in the first place. So in this scenario, this is a time series. Step 1 is to the top left. Step 2 is top right. Step 3 is bottom left. Step 4 is bottom right. So you have a house on the shoreline, very modest house. You have your mean high water, mean low water. This area right here, if you can see my pink cursor in that red circle, that's a piece of land, that's your intertidal zone. So this is the condition assumed here, receding shoreline from erosion. Landowner puts in a bulkhead in this slide number 2, top right, to protect the property. And now you start to see vertical erosion. Basically this intertidal from slide square 1, in square 3, it's smaller. And then in square 4, it's complete loss, meaning at low tide, when this light blue is gone, it is still covered with water. So the intertidal area is lost. So you start to add up doing this treatment around a series of shorelines, and you can see how much impact it has on the wildlife that need that. Here's why. What happens is when waves hit a vertical rigid structure, they bounce off it. They don't, the energy isn't lost, it isn't dissipated, it just bounces off it and erodes down and along it. And so you just lose all that sediment there. And there's lots of studies to show that along a bulkhead on the right of this cartoon here is much less biological diversity of organisms compared to a natural shoreline and a living shoreline. Haven't got into the living shorelines yet, but you already have that data. There's measured results of crabs, fish, other things to show that it's just much more diverse and much higher abundance near a natural shoreline. And that's, I think, pretty intuitive probably to most of you on this call. Trivia question number 2. In just Barnegat Bay alone, approximately how much of the shoreline is bulkheaded? Your choices are 10%, 20%, 40%, or 80%. All right, I think we're ready to close the poll. Excellent. The majority of you picked 40%, and that is the correct answer. And if you ever looked at Barnegat Bay, from an aerial image, you'll see, particularly the northern part of the bay, heavily developed, a lot of bulkheads. Where we put people and things that we want to protect, we start to armor the shoreline. So I want to get into defining a living shoreline. I put definition in quotes here because there's a little wiggle room in the definition, somewhat subjective. I tend to take a very broad view of the definition of living shorelines. I'm not alone in that, but there are folks with narrower views, and so be it. So this image from the Corps of Engineers I find very useful. So I'll set you up here. You have an exposed shoreline exposed to the waves. Someone comes in, puts in this breakwater, could be made of rock, some precast material. Sediment can accumulate on its own behind it because now the waters are calmer, they're not eroding, they're actually accreting. And a marsh starts to form here. And this is your living shoreline. So to me, that's a really useful way to look at living shorelines. It's what's happening at the shoreline, not what you use for it. If you decide, if you go in for a project and you need to put in some structure, and it's very common that that's needed, this is what you're going to get an application for. But this is the result. The desired result is to have a shoreline that's living, where the water can still come in and out, sediment can come back and forth, animals can come back and forth. You have essentially still the biological, ecological foundation for a natural shoreline. So there's a range of living shorelines, from green on the left to gray on the right, often referred to as softer on the left, harder on the right. On the left, often referred to as more natural, on the right, more engineered. And you can start with, this is very simplistic. There's a lot of variety here, but you can start with vegetation only. You can put in plants, and if there's really little wave energy, the plants will hold the soil and you're good. Immediately you start to put in edging. This here looks like a cartoon of a coconut fiber log. It's a log, it's what it sounds like. It's a log made of coconut fiber. That helps hold back some of the wave energy while the plants get established. And once they get established, this is biodegrading. So then you're left with a natural shoreline. Very quickly, you get into putting in a sill. A sill is basically some structure at the shoreline, right? The marsh toe here. Breakwaters, which is structure offshore. And right about here is where I think most people I know, practitioners I know, are comfortable with living shorelines, calling them living shorelines. To the right of this line, you have revetments, which are essentially usually piled rocks, but it could even be solid concrete revetment up against the sloped shoreline, and then a bulkhead or seawall rigid vertical structure. There are times when a revetment is still a better option than a bulkhead. And this is where I want to point out that living shorelines, I see them always as a compromise. There's an erosion issue. Either you leave it or you're going to do something. If you're going to do something, what are the options? And we at TNC always want to make sure, and a lot of our partners, the same thing, the most natural, the least impactful option is proposed. But there are some scenarios where you have really high wave energy from boat wakes or just wind-driven wakes, and you need to protect it, and a revetment may be the only thing that's keeping you from putting in a bulkhead. A revetment at least has some value when it's made of rock like this. The number one, the wave energy actually goes up it. It doesn't bounce off it. It has nooks and crannies. Some things will grow on it. And there are scenarios where you can actually plant between the stones. That's an ecologically enhanced revetment. So that is a potential option. So now I'm going to get into different types of living shorelines. Again, a few examples. These are real life examples. Living shorelines started in Maryland, so there's tons of examples from the Chesapeake Bay. And this happens to be one of them. I don't have the site offhand, but I got this from the Virginia Institute of Marine Sciences. So this is a coconut fiber log along the shoreline. And behind here, this is planted with marsh grass. And I think another thing I want to draw your attention to is this little puddle of water here. There's another here. This is a gap between these logs. Anytime there's an edge treatment or structure, even offshore, the regulations, I'll say 99% of the time, will require a gap. And that is to allow, when the water flows out, organisms not like fish in particular, and say some crabs, not to be trapped behind the structure. And this is the before, and this is probably a year or two afterwards. That biolog has, coconut fiber log is biodegraded, and this is what you have. This works in a very low energy environment. When I say low energy, I mean there's not a lot of wave activity from whether boats or wind-driven waves. Very quickly in living shorelines, you get into some sort of structure. This is a marsh sill. This also comes out of Maryland. I could tell this is probably a year, maybe two at the most, after this was built because their strings are here. And these strings are put up when a planting goes in to keep the geese from devouring all the new plantings. It lets them get established. They can take the string away. But the string will actually literally prevent geese from getting in there, from landing. They can't fly out easily, something along those lines. And again, here's that gap, even a bigger gap to allow water through, organisms through. And I do want to point out, all these photos are almost always taken at low tide so we can see what was done. So these structures are, on this one, it's probably, the white is probably exposed at high tide. There are some where these are lower. It really depends on the system and what the design calls for. So sometimes you never see the rocks, but again, these pictures always show the structure. This is a little unusual type of breakwater. I'm introducing now to breakwaters, which are off the shore. This is a demonstration project by the American Littoral Society. TNC helped fund this through funds from our donors. This is a branch box breakwater. I don't recommend trying to say that too quickly, too many times. And these are the marsh that they're trying to protect is to the right here, and the open water is to the left. This is on the Mechedeconk River, Point Pleasant Borough. And these pilings went in. These are pilings that would hold up a pier. They get hammered in with heavy equipment. And then the middle parts of these get stuffed with branches. They borrowed this technique from lake restoration out in California, and we're gonna see how it holds up. The idea is they may actually have to bring back more of these branches as they degrade, but the idea is this is gonna slow the wave energy and also probably trap sediment back here. And so they're monitoring that. This just went in May 2019. So this is an image of people actually bringing these are repurposed Christmas trees, and we're bringing them in to essentially stuff them into those branch boxes. And one thing I want to point out is living shorelines often have a component where you can involve the public, the community, and that really helps expand the impact of a project to get people to see what's going on, why it matters, why our shorelines matter. In this one, they collected Christmas trees, used Christmas trees, over a couple of years. The Department of Public Works housed all of them, then they delivered them to the site, and there's all these volunteers putting them out there. So it was really a big community project. So a lot of people got to be aware of this project through that effort. And here's just a picture of us stuffing them in and tying them into place. Another type of breakwater. There's a lot of types of breakwaters in the living shoreline world. This is Gandy's Beach. This is a TNC project. This is our signature living shoreline project. It's made of oyster castles, which are a trademark product. These dashed lines along the shore are those structures. They're oyster castles. They're modular, sort of like a cinder block, but they link together better, and they're made with slightly different material made for the marine environment that oysters can attach to. And so they're breaking the wave energy. So this shoreline erosion is slowed. We actually have data, so it's not just slowed, it's actually started to accrete. And not only are they doing that, but because it's an attachment surface and there's a lot of oysters naturally in Delaware Bay, they'll get oysters to attach. And so these are oysters covering those structures. You can just barely see where the pink cursor is here, some of the corners of the structures, but it's really covered. So even though you have a structure, it has this biological value to it. And it's not just the oysters, there's algae that grows on here. There are fish that will take refuge in here and feed in here. Another type of breakwater. These are headland control breakwaters. This is out of the Chesapeake. They're either in this chevron shape or they can be straight. They're made with some rigid structure, often stone. This spit of land that connects them to the mainland is called a tombolo. That can either be made by filling it with sand, or sometimes they'll accrete naturally. And this C shape here, this scalloped shoreline, is the result. This is erosion, but it's predictable and it's stable. Once it gets to a certain point, it won't erode anymore. And the advantages of these is you can put them in and space them further than you would have another type of breakwater. So you can space these further if you're willing to allow for the scalloped shoreline, if you have that kind of space. Here's one more type. It's WAD. It should say breakwater, WAD, breakwater. WAD stands for Wave Attenuation Device, like the Oyster Castle. This is a trademark product made specifically for this purpose. And this is in Sunken Island. It's an island owned by Florida Audubon. It's in Tampa Bay. And these are the structures in a line with the gaps between them, and you can actually see sediment accreted behind them and a little bit of erosion between them. Again, that's scalloping. And I show you this from the air because it's kind of innocuous. When you see them up close, they are can be a little intimidating looking. This is what they look like in person. Their size is based on the depth of the water for the most part. There almost always a piece of them sticks out of water. This is mostly at low tide. Oysters are attaching to them, so they actually even provide their own biological value. Algae attaches to them. There's space inside, so fish will get in there again. Small fish will go and feed those places, and they're protected when that's happening. But this attenuates the wave energy that's going toward this shoreline. It's open water off the screen to the left, and the shoreline is protected. And they're specifically designed to break up the wave energy in a way that you can probably stand in this water during a storm and not really feel it. And sediment will accrete behind it. Now I'm going to get into, I'm done with the sort of living shorelines things where it's the treatment you do to maintain a natural like shoreline. Now, I put this in quotes, enhanced armor. I don't know the official term. There's Florida, program in Florida is calling it redeemed bulkheads. I like that. I called it enhanced armor. So basically there are situations in urban areas, think urban areas where everything's really tightly spaced. You have a lot of wave activity, a lot of boat activity. You can't really do very much to extend your shoreline or make a natural shoreline. But there are options for, and people are looking into this, a lot of research into, what can be done to the bulkhead or seawall to make it better for fish. And this is in Seattle. This is a Seattle seawall. This was this happens to be obviously at low tide. There's a maintenance worker or somebody walking on this part. And this was basically a smooth seawall. And this structure was added to it. These little platforms, terraces were added. And they are to allow for the attachment of algae, mussels, whatever would naturally attach in the system. And this is so that it helps with salmon. Salmon in the Northwest, as we know, is incredibly important and valuable. So they're trying to do these things to help support the salmon fishery in these really urban settings. Not only did they do this to the seawall, but over top, you see lights getting through. They opened up the sidewalk in its glass panels, and light is really important for, from what I understand, most anadromous fish that migrate upstream to spawn. And so before this was shadowed, there were no salmon seen. Now it has light and these structures. And here are the effects. These are first year juvenile salmon, and these are the structures, those platforms to your right. So now they're in this system that hadn't been seen before. Here's one more type of enhanced armor. This is in Brooklyn Bridge Park on the East River in New York. This is a riprap revetment, or really a boulder revetment. The East River, if you've ever been in it or seen it, it's really, really turbid, and there's a lot of boat activity. So it's a place where you're not going to be able to really put in a natural shoreline. So what's done here, what this gentleman is kneeling on, is a manufactured tide pool. And that is made specifically of a material and texture to allow the attachment of organisms that would naturally attach in the marine environment, algae, oysters, maybe mussels. And it also holds water at low tide. The rock doesn't, it drains. And so maybe little fish would be in there, maybe insects. But it's meant, and it keeps the algae alive at low tide instead of it drying off. And so this is a pilot. They just put in a few to see how it would do. After 6 months, here's the growth. You can see these little patterns here, maybe the little U in the bottom left here. That's the structure itself, but this red is algae growing on it. After 14 months, it starts to look like almost like a coral reef. Okay, so do they work? This is an image on the left of a failing bulkhead in Florida, just for the topic. So I've already talked about the value of them ecologically, but structurally, are they valuable? So there are a couple of studies, but I'm going to talk about one in North Carolina after Hurricane Irene. Hurricane Irene came to through North Carolina as a Category 1 hurricane. Category 1 hurricanes are named for their wind speed, not for tidal surge, not for precipitation, just for wind speed. Category 1 is 74 to 95 miles per hour. So it went through North Carolina with that wind speed in gusts, even higher. They surveyed, this team of scientists surveyed 27 miles of shoreline in different areas. 17 miles of that was bulkhead. 10 miles of it was mostly marsh, natural marsh, and a couple of living shoreline projects. So I'll tell you that in all sections that they looked at, bulkheads were damaged. In one section, just inside the Outer Banks, where the conditions were worst, highest sustained winds and longest fetch, meaning the biggest waves, they surveyed just over a mile of bulkheads. And these are all divided up by landowners and things like that. So it's not just one continuous mile, but a mile. It was damaged. 76% of the bulkheads were damaged. So that tells you about the bulkhead end of things, that they don't, you know, they're not all we think they may be. They look strong, but they may not be what they aren't that strong, actually. So trivia question number 3. In this same assessment of the shoreline condition in North Carolina following Hurricane Irene, what portion of the living shorelines were damaged? So you have choices of 0%, so none of them were damaged, 25%, 50%, 75%. And I'll tell you, this is your last trivia question. So, all right, I think we're ready to close the poll. So the most popular response was 25%. Actual answer is 0. There was no damage to the natural shorelines or the living shorelines, none at all. What they did find was some of the vegetation was less dense, and that recovered within a year. So they're really resilient. That's one of the things about hard structures and living shorelines and natural shorelines, really, that often gets lost in the conversation is a bulkhead seawall might do its job in certain conditions for a while, but someday it's going to need to be replaced. And when it's damaged, it'll need to be replaced. It is not resilient. It does not grow back. You have to put in a new one the next time. A living shoreline has a lot of upfront work, but they're more resilient. It can handle these natural forces much better. It's trying to mimic nature, and our natural systems, marshes and things, have handled them for a long time. This is just an image of what Hurricane Irene did in the Outer Banks. This is Route 12 in North Carolina. So that's what it did to a road, and living shorelines survived this. So I want to talk a little bit about living shorelines in New Jersey and then what TNC has done. So I mentioned, I think, that living shorelines started as a practice in Maryland in the 70s. A man named Ed Garbage from Environmental Concern started it. He did not know he was starting a movement. He's called them non-structural stabilization or something along those lines. In the 80s, it was term living shorelines was coined. So in New Jersey, they didn't really start until 2007. This was one of the sites in a project that was the first one to really to be implemented. This is at Matt's Landing, which is in Heislerville in Cumberland County. That's the Delaware Bay estuary. And it's very simple. They put in 2 rows of coconut fiber logs. The outer one's lower, the inner one is a little higher. The sediment here accreted on its own. It's actually very firm. I've seen somebody walk on this. And then the marsh grass colonized it naturally. So all they did was put these materials in, and the rest happened on its own. It took over a year to get the permits for this. It was just a different time in New Jersey for living shorelines. The permitters didn't understand them. There was no permit for living shorelines. It was a special case. And so that's the state of living shorelines in 2007. More NGOs, nonprofits started taking these on: American Littoral Society, New York, New Jersey Baykeeper, Mordecai Land Trust. And when TNC started its coastal program, that was in 2012, 4 days before Hurricane Sandy hit ground. And the coastal program ever since has been focused on coastal resilience, particularly helping communities deal with the impacts of flooding, storms, accelerating sea level rise. using nature and nature-based solutions. So at that time, we talked to our partners, and it was clear that a decision support tool was needed to help assess shorelines overall in the state. So we worked with partners to develop what we call the Living Shoreline app. This is on a website called coastalresilience.org. So this is an online tool. And this is an aerial image of, this is the segment of the Hackensack River. This is in Bergen County. And basically, the tool color codes the shoreline. And then when you can click on a square and it tells you what it means. So I happen to click on this yellow square right here. And yellow is 4, and it means a number of shoreline edge techniques that are applicable in this spot. And the data down here will show in bold which ones, it'll say yes, 6 parameters are met. So 6 or more parameters that this analysis did were met, and these 4 types are potential edge treatments here, living shoreline treatments here. And there's a whole bunch of data behind this, and you can click on other features to see what the shoreline erosion change rate is, really, erosion or accretion, tidal range, salinity, shoreline slope, and other things you might need to help plan a project. So this was definitely a useful tool. It still is a useful tool for this type of work. It was also very useful for community outreach. So we and our partners used it for that purpose, to get into communities, to educate them, and start conversations about potential projects. So then we took it to a next step, and we thought, rather than, we did implement the Gandy's Beach Oyster Castle breakwaters I showed you earlier, but we didn't think it was efficient to implement one project at a time. How do we, instead of us going to the communities, what if we bring them to us? So we started a small grant program called the Living Shorelines Incentives Program, where we see if we could give some seed money to a project to help fund design or permitting or construction to get them over the hump. So we started that program in 2017, and we got 10 applications and funded 2 projects. And then in the process, we learned a lot of education was needed. So we started expanded the program to include small grants, but also education like you see here. This is an in-person session. We had online webinars. We had one-on-one technical assistance from our staff to go see sites and give input and reports. We also created a community resource guide for planning projects that runs from understanding what living shorelines are through funding and permitting. And this was quite successful. These sit-down sessions were always at capacity. This room held about 50 or so, and they were at capacity. Some of them even had waiting lists. And the topics were things like design, permitting and regulations, lessons from other projects. So, so we did this program of 2017, and 2019 I did a tally of our impact. So again, we had 10 projects to start. We had 10 applications for that first grant program. We expanded the program to education and these other things. And so I looked at how many people we engaged, whether it was they attended a webinar, they put it, one of the teams that put in, a member of a team that put in an application for a project. And here's just dots on a map of New Jersey. The pink ones with a dot in the center, those are towns, municipalities, literally municipal representatives that we engaged. There's 31 of those. The green or blue squares, those are county representatives. There's 7 of those, 7 counties, 31 towns. There's actually much more people behind each one of those. So that's our engagement at that level. In all, we engaged, to my count, 336 individuals over those 2 years. And this is sort of how it breaks up proportionately. So I don't know if you heard me mention, or maybe I didn't, at the beginning, that in New Jersey, nonprofits were this green one here, nonprofits were the only ones doing living shorelines at the time. And so we wanted to reach a wider audience in some way, and we did. We had federal agencies showing up, county, of course, people who were unaffiliated with anything, a lot of them private landowners, faculty from academia, municipal representatives, state representatives, and consultants were the biggest. There were about 80 or so consultants from 45 different firms. So now, before we started this program, it was, again, just the usual suspects doing these, NGOs. The engineers didn't know how to design them. The regulators didn't really know what they were and understand them. And so, and landowners, you private landowners, public landowners weren't even thinking about them. And now we're in a place where there's multiple engineers who would bid on a project if you said you get pricing from, if you had a project you wanted to do. That wasn't the case before. And some of these engineers are not your typical sort of green engineers. There's some of them are municipal engineers that are used to building roads and sewer systems and things like that. They're bidding on these projects. So, and municipalities are doing them. Some private landowners are looking into them. So it's really grown, the audience we've reached. And that's really all I have on the topic for you. I here leave you with a slide of our next event. And I'll just see if anybody has any questions. Sue, does anybody have any questions in the chat?
Yes, we do have some questions, Bill. First question, are there any cases where the plants that colonize are undesirable invasives and you then have to be proactive and remove them?
That's a very interesting question. I'll say good because it stumps me a little bit. Let's see. Honestly, offhand, I have not seen that. And I think, but it could happen. So it depends on the part of a estuary you're in. In our tidal systems, our invasive plant, really the only one I can think of is Phragmites, common reed. It's the one that fills the Hackensack meadowlands. And that requires lower salinities. So in a lot of these areas where the salinities are high, it's unlikely to colonize, but it's definitely something that needs to be looked out for. And it's definitely something that comes up in permit review. The regulators want to know if you're going to monitor this, and if the elevation is a little too high, too much sediment accretes, will Phragmites start to come in? So that is, it's a risk, but it's not a big one at all in this situation.
Okay, in the Florida picture, the slide that showed the damaged bulkhead, it didn't look like there'd be much room to replace the wall with a living shoreline structure. Would you be able to create a natural defensive structure in places like that?
When there's not much room, you can't do very much unless the landowner is willing to give up some of their land and you're going to cut into it. That's highly unlikely. They might give a little if they can take a little of the open water, but often there's not enough space. But what can be done is sometimes there are structures put at the base of a existing bulkhead just to add places for fish to hide and things, and it had some structural diversity or textural diversity. In Galveston Bay, there is a Galveston Bay Foundation has done living shorelines in front of bulkheads, but what they've done is essentially build a perched wetland. It's sort of, they have a bulkhead, and just below it, they put out another bulkhead, fill it with sediment, and plant it. And that's where they can't do anything else, but they're adding some ecological value. So it really depends on the setting, but it's a challenging spot.
Mm-hmm. How far away from the shoreline are living shorelines typically built, or does it depend on the individual situation?
It depends on the individual situation. You may have something like that marsh sill I showed earlier, mm-hmm. Where you might put a structure right up against the foot of a marsh. You might need something further offshore to break the wave energy. So it really depends on the situation. There's definitely, we referred to the built things as engineered. These are also very engineered. You need an engineer to get at, who understands these things, to get at the calculations, to figure out the fetch and the slope and things like that, to figure out where things need to be put to work. And then it's a negotiation with the regulators, because they're not a fan of structures going in the water, taking up open bottom, because that's considered a natural habitat. You're replacing it with something. So there's definitely a back and forth conversation about how needed it is, can you get it closer to shore, how wide it needs to be. So there's always a little pushback in the negotiation in the process.
Speaking of regulators, is it easier to get permits for living shorelines in New Jersey today compared to when the first project was proposed?
Yes, it's night and day. When living shorelines were being proposed, I said 2007, I found regulators in New Jersey weren't even quite understanding ecological restoration, let alone living shorelines. Most ecological restoration, at least in coastal areas that I'm aware of, were always done as part of mitigation for a development project, not for the purpose of restoration for the benefit of the environment alone. and then come along living shorelines, it was very challenging. Since then, and this happened right after Sandy, but it was in development before Sandy, the state developed a general permit just for living shorelines. And when you go for permits, there are general permits and individual permits. Your goal is to fit the parameters of a general permit. It helps your review. It means you've met certain things. And it essentially means more likely if you meet those parameters, you're going to get approved. Individual means you have this out-of-the-box project. It needs more extensive review, a lot more data collection, a lot more expense in that. So anyway, they got a general permit developed in New Jersey. The Corps of Engineers a couple of years ago, I think in 2014 or so, 2016, put out a nationwide permit just for living shorelines. That was a new thing, another big help. And now in New Jersey, they're talking about revising the rules so that there might be some where the living shoreline is on the sort of softer side, the more natural side, where it may not really need an extensive permit or review. So it'd be very, very quick. And again, and that matters for expenses. How much does it cost you to get these projects done?
Can you talk a little bit about the costs and efforts involved in maintenance of living shorelines compared to breakwaters?
Yeah, there's definitely, it's definitely a question that has come up quite a bit. A living shoreline needs some maintenance, like one's garden or backyard needs maintenance. It's generally not too extensive. It may mean there's some debris after a storm that's smothering the plants. You might want to replant some areas. There could be some scour depending, but if it was designed right, for the most part, it's relatively minimal maintenance, but it needs something. It's generally, I guess they live longer than their rigid counterparts. And in many cases, they're just, we don't know how long they'll live because we don't have enough time yet. We need more time to figure out how long they last. They're lasting a long time.
Can living shorelines be used in other waters like lakes and rivers?
I would say yes to lakes. Lakes are different in that they don't have tides, although in large lakes like the Great Lakes, you have wind-driven tides rather than astronomical tides. But they're because the shoreline, it's similar parameters. Living shorelines can work in lakes. Rivers are different. There are things like living shorelines, but they're different because rivers are directional, the way the water flows, and how they flood. When in a heavy precipitation event, it's different features. There are living shoreline type things you can do, but it's not called living shorelines. It's just another line of work that happens, or a group of, another specialty that works in rivers to do that.
Okay, well, why build them if they're only going to be underwater in 20 to 30 years?
So a couple of things. So there's a few ways I look at this. One is if your alternative is a rigid structure or a living shoreline, your living shoreline will adapt to that change, whether you need to increase its height or if water continues to rise, it's also going to move inland. You might need to build another living shoreline, whereas a bulkhead will just stop doing what it was intended to do. You need to build a brand new one. So living shorelines are definitely more adaptable and allow the shoreline to be more adaptable into the future. They allow marshes and whatever in the intertidal to migrate inland, which is what we really want to see happen rather than hit a vertical wall and then marsh is gone. And the other is, there was, when I first got into, I'll say, ecological restoration, accelerating sea level rise was not a conversation. And now it is, and we're doing something to think about that. And this question has come up. And so we just live in a more dynamic coastal environment now. And it's, I think, our job to do what we can while we're here to get it to whatever future, whatever the future is. So we're sort of doing the best we can to maintain some of the ecosystems and the resilience into the future, because that's needed for the organisms out there. It's still valuable. The other alternative is for whoever wants to do that project to move what they're worried about, the water encroaching upon. But I think in all settings, it's pretty much your better option when you're thinking about whether they're going to be drowned or not. Anything on the shoreline will be drowned in the future.
Is the Nature Conservancy monitoring any species other than oysters at Gandy's Beach?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. And I don't have all this. Yeah, we are. I do know fish, crabs are being monitored. And horseshoe crabs, because that's a horseshoe crab breeding beach. So they're monitored just to see if there's any entanglement in the structures themselves, which there isn't, which is wonderful. So those are the kinds of things we're looking at. We have partners doing that, Partnership for the Delaware Estuary, Rutgers University.
We don't have any more questions at the moment, but we do have more time. So folks, please feel free to type your questions into the chat. In the meantime, Patty, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, just really quick to add to, let me turn my video on so folks can see me as well. To the last question about Gandy's Beach, as Bill mentioned, yes, our partners are monitoring more than just oysters. And it has found that those reefs are definitely collecting much more fish and all the other macroinvertebrates that inhabit the intertidal zone. So they're definitely providing that additional three-dimensional habitat that we were aiming for. So it is very much a win-win for both all of the critters and the marsh as well. And it's also doing, because there's oysters on it, it's filtering the water. So at high tide, it filters 1 million gallons or so of water, I think an hour, to help improve the water quality in that area. So there's a lot of multiple benefits to that. And then the other thing I wanted to add, just sort of thinking, for the folks who were able to join last week on my presentation about marsh restoration, living shorelines very much goes hand in hand with thinking about keeping our coastal habitats in place. We have to protect both the edge and the top of the marsh. And we're very excited about the progress that's been made in the state since 2007 for that first Living Shoreline project that Bill talked about in the Delaware Bay. It's definitely become easier, and we're working with the state and our partners to make it even easier to permit these projects, whether it's a homeowner wanting to do a little pocket project or thinking much more broadly about coastal restoration. They're definitely just one tool in the toolbox when it comes to coastal resilience. There's a new question.
Okay, is Bill a bass fiddle player, Bill?
That is an aspiration at this time. I have a bass fiddle. I've literally yet to touch it because I did not want to learn bad habits. So I'm like, oh, let me just take some lessons. My wife bought me lessons, and I'm like, oh, I don't have time for lessons. That's why it sits there.
But it's very decorative.
It is. It sounds great. We liked it a lot. It's made in Germany.
I just want to thank everybody for joining us today. On behalf of the Nature Conservancy, we really do appreciate everything that you do to help our work go forward. It's incredibly important, and we are so grateful. I want to ask staff to turn their videos on.